Surveys are one way to collect data, and we've said that they are prone to bias, so we'll examine that further now. So really common ways to survey: you can talk to people face to face, you could send an email, you could call people on the telephone, you could send it through the postal, we'll send through the post office. And there's pros and cons to each of these different methods, but they are prone to bias, and so we should look at the various different types of potential sources of biases when you take surveys. The first one we'll call, or the first one we're going to discuss, is called a selection bias. It's when the method of selecting the sample, if the way you've chosen to select the sample over or under represents a subset of that population, you have introduced selection bias in the survey. So two ways that this happens is convenience sampling, or if you just ask for volunteers. There's also something called the non-response bias. It is the systematic tendency for people who elect, that is, they're volunteering, to take this survey. Well, they might not be volunteering, but the people who do take the survey, they somehow differ from the population in some important way. So let's say this. Say, for example, there was a 90% non-response rate to your survey. Can you take the result of that survey legitimately? I mean, you could have to ask yourself, well, is it possible that some of the participants could not be contacted? And if so, we should examine our methodology. And if only 10% of those people who were contacted respond, perhaps it is that only the people who felt really strongly about this issue responded, and that actually skewed the results towards the people who have strong feelings towards it. There's also response bias. We have to ask, all right, the way we asked these questions, did it influence the responses? So there's a couple of different ways this could happen. Was there a deliberate wording bias? Were the words worded in such a way as to elicit a specific response? Were you leading the witness, as it were? There's also this idea of how does the interviewer influence the responses? The tone and the demeanor of the interviewer can influence answers. And similarly, the setting in which the interview takes place can also influence the responses. We also have to worry about vague wording bias, confusing language. Often, seldom, or usually are very subjective terms. Your often might be more frequent than my often. And this interpretation it's just interpreted differently by different individuals. So did this vague wording confuse the participants, and therefore the legitimacy of the data can be called into question. Similarly, was there unnecessarily complex wording to the question, and that led to confusion as well? There are different ways that you can order the questions. This is a pretty big topic, so we'll just leave it at that for right now. How you order the questions can also lead to some confusion. Did you only ask uninformed people? So again, can we use this data if no one knew what you were asking about? Again, we run into the problem of the voluntary response of the respondents. Again, only the people who feel strongly about the issue responded and skewed the results. Humans are not perfect. We are flawed, and we may not remember things accurately. So the faulty recall of the participants may also skew the data. That is, the participants did not accurately remember, and therefore they gave inaccurate answers. It can also happen that the participants really like the interviewers, or these people who are responding, they just really want to please. So they will say whatever they think is necessary to please the other person. We also have problems about confidentiality concerns. So if you're asking about really sensitive natured questions, that people may, for example, get in trouble over giving the answers, then over confidentiality concerns, participants may give untruthful answers and therefore compromise the legitimacy of the data collected.